Ever since Five Nights at Freddy's 3 came out in 2015, there's been a debate about who the guard in this game is, especially since in every other game we either learn the protagonist's name or we get hints to who they are. FNaF 3 is the odd one out. Well, I guess there's FNaF AR too, but who cares about FNaF AR? The suspects at the time were Mike Schmidt, Jeremy Fitzgerald, Fritz Smith, or just some random guy. However, over the years, the list of suspects has lengthened. I've already made a video about who the protagonist is before, but I feel like I have to remake it because it just could be better, and there's more I have to add. This is a mystery I care a lot about because FNaF 3 is in my top 3 games of the series. There are 2 candidates and new evidence I want to talk about. Before we get into all that, let's talk about all the things we know about the Fright Guard. Number 1, they have worked at the location for at least one night prior to the game's events.
Hey, glad you came back for another night. I promise it'll be a lot more interesting this time.
Now, it should be noted this is most likely a meta line for the player, Scott thanking us for coming back to play another game, but still, it does show that unlike every other guard within the series, Night 1 isn't the first night on the job for our character. Number 2, they seem to survive the fire at the end of the game. Yeah, that's it. We don't know anything about this guy. Before we talk about who the guard can be, let's talk about who can't be the guard. Jeremy Fitzgerald. At the time, Jeremy was, well, I guess he'd be 4th, not that popular. Decently popular, I don't know. But now we know he just can't be the guard. It's implied in FNaF 2 already that Jeremy is the victim of the bite of 87, and it's even more implied in the week before, where Ralph types in the numbers 1987 in the phone and hears his phone call to Jeremy about getting moved to the day shift. Since the previous code, 1983, was about the bite of 83, it's reasonable to assume this is about the bite of 87, connecting Jeremy to the event. I mean, he already was, but still. And with all the other foreshadowing in FNaF 2, it seems strongly implied that Jeremy is the bite victim. We also learned the week before that the victim can't do much of anything. This would include being a night guard at a horror attraction 30 years later. Some people think that Ralph just doesn't have all the information and Jeremy's just fine, but I find that very unlikely because it requires the story to just lie to us. It was a better explanation when we could argue Ralph didn't know anything just from the FNaF 1 phone call, but since in the week before we learned the press focused on the bite and that the victim was never able to tell anyone what happened, I think it's pretty likely Jeremy did lose his frontal lobe and can't do anything. So yeah, Jeremy isn't the guard. But if you think Jeremy isn't the bite of 87 victim, just use the Fritz Smith evidence. You know, they're basically the same guy anyway. I know they're not the same guy, by the way. They have the same evidence, basically. With who it can't be out of the way, let's talk about who it can be. There are the 5 I talked about last time. Michael Afton, main protagonist of 1, 4, Sister Location, FNaF 6. Hudson Foster, protagonist of the Fazbear's Fright story What We Found, which is heavily inspired by FNaF 3. Henry Emily, setman from FNaF 6. Cassie's dad, protagonist of Help Want 2, and Sammy Emily, Henry's son from the novels. But there are 2 new candidates I want to add to the table. Fritz Smith, the secondary protagonist of FNaF 2, being playable on Custom Night, and William Afton himself, the main antagonist of the franchise, which I know sounds crazy, but just wait for it. Some people also think it could be a nameless random person, but at that point you might as well believe it's Hudson. This video is going to be a long one, so get a drink, a snack, and relax, because this is going to be my most definitive video on the Five Nights at Freddy's 3 Night Guard, and probably the most definitive video on YouTube, if we're being honest. However, before we get to the suspects, we have to talk about the Phantoms. A lot of people use the Phantoms as evidence for the Fright Guard's identity. I even use them as the smoking gun in my original video. However, over time I've come to realize that they don't really matter for the guard's identity. And what we found, we learned that the Phantoms are hallucinations that seem to be caused by Afton's presence within Fazbear's Fright, based on the guard's past trauma, but also seem to be based on the props in the attraction. They probably have something to do with the agony in the location since the Phantoms don't reappear in FNaF 6. Now, that's not the main thing with the Phantoms. The main point for the guard's identity is Withered Freddy and Foxy. Since those guys aren't props in the attraction, people take this to mean the guard must have seen Withered Freddy and Foxy. However, the Phantoms being based on the Withereds can be easily explained. Phantom Freddy can be explained by the Shadow Freddy Easter egg in The Office, and Withered Foxy can be explained by Withered Foxy's hook in the FNaF 3 Office. It's also possible that the guard just knows what the withered animatronics look like, since the Fright crew likely would have done research into what the animatronics looked like during FNaF 2 and would have found pictures or something. Pictures the guards could have seen. Or maybe again it's something to do with agony, I don't know. Or maybe the withered designs do not matter and Scott just uses the classics and withereds interchangeably. Although I do think they probably did look different in universe. My point is, the Phantoms don't really matter that much for the guard's identity. For certain characters, I do think we could argue that them being there and so prominent is evidence, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. With that, let's get into our first candidate. Sammy is a very unpopular theory for the Fright Guard. He even got removed from that huge FNaF theory tier list. His is a unique one because unlike all the other suspects, there is no evidence for Sammy being the guard. It's a headcanon. It's a cool headcanon, but it's a headcanon nonetheless, so yeah, just throw him out. It's definitely not him. Fritz Smith is the next person I want to talk about, assuming he isn't Michael Afton, of course, which I don't believe he is, as I explained in a previous video. Although, something I didn't bring up in that video is that another reason I don't think Mike is Fritz anymore is because of Scott's rule of clarification. Scott likes to clarify things in the next game. Once the theory of Mike being Fritz became extremely popular, he showed in the next game that one of the missing kids was named Fritz, find that the guard and kid are related. This wouldn't be bad if Jeremy's name wasn't reused too. This means there are two options. Jeremy and Fritz are the parents of the MCI victims, or related to them in some way, or Mike is both Jeremy and Fritz, and he is using the names of William's victims. Mike Schmidt could be the name of a DCI victim, I guess. This idea was called out in the Ultimate Guide, interestingly enough, and what's even more interesting is that it was one of the new pages for the book. It wasn't in the other versions of it. Mike being Jeremy is unlikely because, again, the week before implies Jeremy is the Bite of 87 victim. And I've gone attached to my Jeremy narrative that I explained in this video. Now, if the movie comes out and Mike, for any reason, used the name Fritz, and Jeremy doesn't show up at all, then yeah, I would probably believe Mike is Jeremy and Fritz. But right now, well, the movie's not out, so yeah. My point is that the graves seem to be Scott clarifying Jeremy and Fritz are the parents of the MCI. Anyway, let's get back to Fritz being the FNAF 3 guard. The evidence for Fritz being the guard is that at the end of the game, the protagonist is never named, perhaps implying they are someone from the past and we have to figure out who they are. And all the phantoms, with the exception of Chica, are either characters introduced in FNAF 2 or based on their appearance in FNAF 2. And FNAF 3 in general seems to have a strange focus on FNAF 2, which I already explained in a previous video, so I'll just play the clip here. Also, FNAF 3 has a strange focus on FNAF 2. The office has a box filled with the toy animatronics and Withered Foxy's hook. In 5 out of 6 of the Happiest Day minigames, we place a character introduced in FNAF 2. The paper pals from FNAF 2 can show up as Easter eggs in the office, but to be fair, so can the FNAF 1 cupcake. And furthermore, all the phantoms except for Chica are based on FNAF 2. It also makes sense for Fritz's hallucinations to be animatronics coming to his office to jumpscare him, since that's what happened to him in FNAF 2, and it was most likely a traumatic experience. I'm gonna be honest, if FNAF 3 was the end of the series, I would probably think Fritz is the guard. However, since the series did not end at 3, I think we can say he is not the guard. Nothing has pointed towards him being the guard since its release, and the phantoms being based on FNAF 2 doesn't matter that much, like I said. The point about the animatronics being based on his trauma from FNAF 2 is pretty decent though. You know, can't really argue with that. That's what I was talking about earlier, where I said the phantoms can be used as minor evidence for some character. There's just more evidence for other characters.
I seem to be trapped inside the Springlock suit.
William being the guard is a theory proposed by the channel, I don't know how to say their name. It's an hour-long video which goes deep into the theory. The basic summary though, and this is definitely not the most in-depth, the idea is that Hudson is a William parallel, and that FNAF 3 happens in William's mind. I can't go too in-depth because I don't want to break down an hour-long video, and you guys should watch it. It is a good video. Some of the evidence I can talk about is that the FNAF 3 teasers say it's all in your mind. There's also the FNAF 3 trailer, where the camera zooms in onto Springtrap's eye, maybe implying that we are going to see things from his POV. Night 6 is also called Nightmare, but Scott has always called Night 6 Nightmare, so yeah. I think it's a fine theory, I just don't think it's what Scott's going for. I suppose the end of what we found could point towards this, as it's implied Springtrap never moves, meaning the night's events were in Hudson's head, but that's it. I just don't think this is what Scott's going for. The All in Your Mind teaser is probably talking about the phantoms, not the entire game, and the trailer going into Springtrap's eye could just be a cool transition. But watch the video and come to your own conclusion. Henry Emily has been a pretty decently popular theory for the guard's identity since FNAF 6, where he was properly introduced. There was even a point where he and Mike were the only real suspects. Oh, how I wish we could go back to those days. Does this theory hold up though? Yeah, it's pretty good. The evidence is that in FNAF 6, Henry recounts the Follow Me minigames, even knowing Afton set a trap.
He lured them all back to a familiar place, back with familiar tricks. He set some kind of trap. I don't know what it was, but he led them there, again. He overpowered them, again. And he robbed them of the only thing that they had, again.
It's possible that Guard dreams the Follow Me minigames between nights, or somehow has visions of them, so Henry may be recounting his dreams while he worked at Fazbear's Fright. Speaking of the minigames, the Guard may help set up the Happiest Day minigames by playing the arcade games, and Return to the Pit seems to kind of imply that Happiest Day is played on arcade, since Oswald, when he goes back in time, you know, does that. Although it is a different thing, but like, it still is Happiest Day, but who knows? If this is true, they are trying to help free the souls, and that was Henry's primary motivation in FNAF 6. Further evidence is that the Silver Eyes was written during FNAF 3's development, so it's possible Scott always intended Henry to be the Guard and kept the name secret so he could figure out Henry was the Guard when the Silver Eyes came out. It's also possible the Guard burnt the place down, and as we know, Henry's plan in FNAF 6 was to burn down the pizzeria with everyone inside. It's possible that FNAF 3 was Henry's first attempt at that plan, and he refined it for FNAF 6, since in FNAF 6 they can't leave, there's no way for William to escape this time. And in FNAF 6, you lure the animatronics away using audio, much like in FNAF 3. It's possible Henry got this idea from working at Fazbear's Fright. Henry being the guard can make sense too. Henry may have wanted to keep up with recent Fazbear locations, even if they aren't official, or he felt a calling to work as a location. As we know from Fazbear's Frights, the book series, it's possible that characters can feel a calling to go to Freddy's due to something called the 0-point field. For example, Greg, the protagonist of the story Fetch, feels a calling to Freddy's. This may be true for Fazbear's Fright, the location too. Something could be calling Henry, not exactly sure what though. With all the evidence for the theory out of the way, we can see it's actually a pretty decent theory. However, almost all the evidence has alternative explanations. As for Follow Me, not only is it not confirmed that the guard has dreams of the minigame, but it's also possible that William documented the minigame's events, and Henry later read these documents. We know Henry has access to William's files, so it's not that much of a reach. As for the guard saying Happiest Day, that is not confirmed, although, again, Return to the Pit, I don't know what to believe anymore. And it seems more likely that BV is setting up the Happiest Day, although I have a problem with this, as we know the minigames do exist in the universe, which seems unnecessary to add if someone in the real world didn't help out in some way, but that's a video for another day. If the guard does play the minigames, it's a solid piece of evidence for Henry. As for the Silver Eyes point, while it's possible, if Scott wanted us to connect the two characters, you think he wouldn't have made Henry kill himself, and also would have implied that he was the guard at some point, or just a guard in general. He never was. But then again, the Silver Eyes is an alternate universe. However, he did say not to use it for the games. As for the audio lures, this may just be for gameplay purposes, and Scott didn't think that much about it. It should also be noted that the lures in FNAF 6 are different. In FNAF 3, there's simply BB's voice lines played in the attraction, while in FNAF 6, they mimic a real human. Also, depending on when FNAF 3 and 6 take place, it's impossible for Henry to be the guard. He has to have spent time setting up FNAF 6. If FNAF 3 and 6 take place in the same year anyway, Henry would be too busy with his plan to work as the guard. As for the fire, it's pretty solid, until we remember this line in UCN.
He tried to release you. He tried to release us. But I'm not gonna let that happen. I will hold you here. I will keep you here, no matter how many times they burn us.
Notice how the vengeful spirit, speaking through Orville, says no matter how many times they burn us, implying more than one person, meaning that whoever set the Fazbear's Fright fire and Henry are different people. Hey guys, I just need to come in here real quick and say I don't actually believe this anymore. I think it's possible that that is implying that multiple people burn them, but you could argue that they're just saying they as a collective, as people in general. No matter how many times they get burnt in general, they're never gonna let go of Afton, right? I still want to include in the video, and I didn't really want to re-edit the entire audio, so I'll just come in here and say no, probably isn't what I said. I still do think the guard did burn it down though, because I feel like it's obvious the guard burned it down, sorry. I know Phone Guy said oh, faulty wiring, but then at the end of the game they do mention foul play. And I feel like it's obviously supposed to apply to us that it was more than faulty wiring. I still think it was faulty wiring. I think the guard used the faulty wiring to cause, or whoever it was, used the faulty wiring to burn the place down. I just feel like it's so obvious, especially since we gotta remember FNAF 3 was the end of the franchise at the time. Feels weird to have the ending be something that could just happen due to random chance. Which, obviously doesn't mean that's not what happened. I just feel like, it's obviously more than just faulty wiring. Someone definitely burned it down with intention. I still don't think the guard is Henry, though. Let's get back to the actual video. Before we get into the, in my opinion, most likely candidates, I just have one thing to ask of you guys, and that is that you subscribe. I know that 92% of you aren't, and it would help me out a ton. And if you've made it this far, you are clearly enjoying the video. Or maybe you're just hate watching, I don't know. Either way, subscribe, and let's get back to the video. Cassie's dad is the newest FNAF 3 guard candidate introduced in Ruin, although the idea spawned with the release of Help 1 and 2. I remember when the game first released, this theory was decently popular. I know a few people believed it, but it seems to have fallen off recently, which sucks because it is a good theory. The evidence is that Cassie's dad's Faz Watch has the code 395248, the same code used in FNAF 3 to get the Stage 01 minigame. Furthermore, Help 1 and 2 seems to parallel FNAF 3's Happiest Day minigames. The player has to unlock the memory dolls by not only playing minigames, but also doing more than what the minigame tells you to do. You figure this out using cryptic clues hidden throughout the game. These dolls also have the mask of the children, much like they did in Happiest Day after giving Golden Freddy the cake. Dolls are also replaced with cake if you repeat the steps to get them. Hell, to unlock one of them you must unlock a secret Phaser Blast level based on FNAF 3, where you go one-on-one against Springtrap, although I guess Plush Baby is there too. Before this, Cassie's dad also set Phaser Blast on fire, which could be a connection to the FNAF 3 fire. The game also has two endings, a good and a bad, and both seem to be canon in some way, much like FNAF 3, where both endings seem to happen. Okay, well, I guess Help 1 and 2's endings aren't really good. There is no good ending, but still, there's a happier ending. The reason I bring this up is because Cassie's dad may be the arcade conspiracist. The whole thing with that guy was playing the Princess Quest arcades to free Vanessa's consciousness or whatever he wanted to do, we're not really sure, although this theory is not confirmed. Another piece of evidence is that the Fazbear's Fright newspaper says that Fazbear's Fright will bring back your childhood in the worst way possible. This line may actually be referring to the person reading the newspaper, the protagonist. And we know Cassie's dad was a fan of Freddy's as a kid, so his childhood will be back in the worst way possible because the characters he loved as a kid are now attacking him. One of them can even kill him. Speaking of, Cassie's dad working at Fazbear's Fright just makes sense. He's a fan of Freddy's, so he wants to work at this attraction based on the franchise's past. And depending on the gap between FNAF 3 and Ruin, he may need money to take care of his recently born daughter. Cassie's dad is actually a very solid theory, although I suppose it does rely on some assumptions, and there are problems with some of the evidence. As for the 395248 code, this could just be a reference to Stage 1 because it's a minigame that takes place at Fredbear's, and Cassie's dad is connected to Fredbear's. After all, it's kind of where he and his friends killed the crying child. Or it could just be a random reference, you know, that happens sometimes. As for the Help Want 2 and FNAF 3 parallels, they do not necessarily imply the protagonist between the games is the same person. The arcade conspirator connections rely on Cassie's dad being the arcade conspirator, but also on the guard playing the Happiest Day minigames. So overall, it is a solid theory, but it does have some problems, but I could definitely see him being the guard. Michael is by far the most popular theory for the identity of the guard, and honestly, it makes sense why. Mike is the main protagonist of the original saga, being the protagonist of 1, 4, 5, and 6. The first piece of evidence for Mike being the guard is the quote, "Bring back your childhood in the worst way possible." As I said earlier, this quote may be referring to the protagonist. Also, the protagonist is not named at the end of the game, which could imply they are characters from the past, and we have to figure out who they are. Mike Schmidt. More evidence comes from the logbook, where Foxy is in the FNAF 3 office. Foxy represents Mike, which I've explained multiple times, so I'll just play a clip here. And let me explain why we know Foxy definitely represents Mike and not Phone Guy, who is named Ralph if you didn't know, as revealed in the week before. Foxy representing Ralph is a kind of a popular idea. I mean, Foxy being Mike is definitely more popular, but I still see Ralph every once in a while. The evidence for Ralph is that in FNAF 2, Ralph says Foxy is his favorite, which is reinforced in the week before. Also, some of the quotes on the night pages are similar to stuff Phone Guy would say. You know, what are you still doing here? Whatever else he says, I forgot. And Ralph being in the FNAF 3 office kinda makes sense because his tapes were played in FNAF 3, just ignore that he wasn't a night guard when those tapes were recorded. However, I think it's more likely Foxy is supposed to be Mike, and here's why. Foxy acts as the protagonist of the book, which Mike is. You know, he's the one who writes it and everything. The best evidence for Foxy being Mike is that on the first night page, Foxy is seen reading a magazine in a chair, which is obviously not an office chair, implying this is at Foxy's home and is applying for the job. The magazine is also a sister location reference. It's a Screw, Bolts, and Hairpins magazine, which was a magazine mentioned in sister location as one of the possible reasons Mike took the job. Further evidence is that in FNAF 4, between nights, there's a minigame called Fun with Plush Trap, where the player, who is Mike, which if you need to know why Mike is the FNAF 4 player, go watch this video on it. Mike goes 1v1 against Plush Trap, who is obviously a reference to Springtrap. And while yes, we now know Plush Trap was a character in the experiments weren't always a plot point, or at least it doesn't seem like they were, so there's probably another explanation for this. And I know that Plush Trap was also a toy that existed before, but it doesn't make sense with him just being a toy because why would Mike have nightmares about him? And it's not just Plush Trap too. With the Halloween update of FNAF 4, 3 new characters were introduced, but only one was canon. Nightmare Balloon Boy. He takes the role of Plush Trap. How do you lure Springtrap away in FNAF 3? You use Balloon Boy's voice lines. I mean, okay, you could argue that it's just because, oh, BB is the smallest, so it makes sense for him to be there, but still, you know, I feel like there could be a deeper connection. Speaking of FNAF 4, the main antagonist of this game is Nightmare, who we learn in the game files is Shadow Freddy. The reason I bring this up is because Shadow Freddy is an Easter egg in FNAF 3. Notice how he looks almost defeated? Perhaps this is because he was defeated by Mike in FNAF 4, and now he's just hanging out with Mike until his death in FNAF 6. Alternatively, Fazbear's Fright could be where Shadow Freddy attached to Mike, and he appears like an empty suit to blend in with the location. Another piece of evidence comes from sister location. Clara, who we know thanks to the logbook represents Mike, or at least Mike relates to her, burns down Vlad's house. Vlad is either William or Fazbear Entertainment, it doesn't really matter. The point is Mike, or a character Mike relates to, burns down one of their houses. If Vlad is William, Fazbear's Fright is where he lives in FNAF 3. If Vlad represents Fazbear Entertainment, Fazbear's Fright houses all their stuff. It's their legacy. This relies on the guard burning down the location. A minor piece of evidence is that the hallucinations the guard has in FNAF 3 are similar to hallucinations Mike has in FNAF 1. What I'm talking about is that the guard can hallucinate posters of Freddy changing to Spring Bonnie. You can also hallucinate the cupcake poster turning to a golden cupcake. This is similar to how in FNAF 1, Mike can hallucinate the Freddy poster changing to one of Freddy ripping off his head, the East Hall posters changing to images of crying children, in the words, "It's me," and the rules poster changing the newspapers about the MCI. And yeah, I know that they aren't exclusive to Mike, but it's still possible that years later he's still having similar hallucinations. And it's possible it was a hint that the guard we played as in 3 was the same as the guard we played as in 1. Further evidence is that in the logbook there's a maze to get to the safe room, and under it Mike draws Freddy, Chica, Foxy in ghost costumes with 3 others in the background. Some say this may represent the Phantoms due to the noticeable lack of Bonnie and the number of animatronics here lining up with the number of Phantoms, and how they are wearing ghost costumes. What's the definition of Phantom? A ghost, and also figments of one's imagination. The Phantoms, under Mike being the FNAF 3 guard, are figments of his imagination based not only on the props of the attraction, but the ghosts from his past. Literally. Speaking of the Phantoms, their behavior makes sense with Mike being the guard. They jump scare the player because that's what they try to do to him in the past. And if sister location happened by the time of FNAF 3, it did happen to him. Smaller piece of evidence comes from the movie, where Mike and William have a 1v1 that ends in the building collapsing. Another minor piece of evidence is that all the versions of the Freddy files, there is this guy, Mathman, who was drawn in a similar style to how Mike draws in the survival logbook. It's possible that this is supposed to be a Mike drawing, and Mike makes all the red pen edits in the book in like a meta sense. Obviously it's not something that happens in the timeline because it's not a real book in the timeline. And he is drawing himself destroying Springtrap because that's what he tried to do in FNAF 3. But to be fair, it could just be a coincidence and this means absolutely nothing. But you know, that's why I said it's a minor piece of evidence. Also, if the guard sets up Happiest Day, it makes sense for Mike to set it up as he would be putting his brother back together if you believe the theory that the Happiest Day minigames are the Bite Victim's memories, which I do and I've explained before. In FNAF 6, the game focuses so little on Mike and William's reunion, despite that being what the last game teased at the very end. Maybe the game focuses on it so little because it already happened. The next point is that it just makes sense for Mike to go to Fazbear's Fright. If FNAF 3 is after Sister Location, it makes sense for Mike to go there because it's the first Freddy adjacent location in years, even if it isn't official, and it's probably his only lead at this point. William would most likely show up here. It's a place that celebrates his crimes, or rumors mainly caused by his crimes. It does seem like William would most likely go here anyway because, you know, his ego. Also, where else would he have to check, assuming at this point he already checked everywhere else? This is the last place he has to go. Basically, my point is here, it makes logical sense for Mike to work there. And if the game is before Sister Location, which I know a lot of people think is debunked due to the logbook having the FNAF 3 office and Mike references Sister Location, it's technically possible that logbook is like a meta book and like doesn't actually happen in the timeline, and it's just meant to confirm lore, not something that, you know, actually does happen in the timeline. If FNAF 3 is before Sister Location, Mike would be working there just for a job, or because he was contacted by the Fright crew personally since he was the last guard at Freddy's. Or who knows, maybe he was looking for William already. I don't know why, but maybe. Finally, many people argue that the final Sister Location cutscene shows the outcome of Mike finding his father, while also showing that William survived their encounter and now they have to meet again in FNAF 6. That's totally up for interpretation though. Some people argue that FNAF 3 fire is what caused the speech, seeing Afton in the newspaper sent Mike on his quest to find his father, or that the speech is setting up their meeting in FNAF 6 only, with Mike saying I'm going to come find you, and then Afton rising to show Mike will find him sometime after this speech. Now let's talk about the problems with Mike being the guard. In FNAF 6, Afton says,
"You may not recognize me at first, but I assure you, it's still me."
If Mike encountered Springtrap like last week, how would he not recognize him? But counterpoint to this, it mainly relies on the assumption that Scraptrap is just a more withered Springtrap. If Scraptrap does look as different as he does out of universe, in universe, then this line probably is just about the redesign. Well, okay, it's about the redesign anyway, like from a meta sense, but I mean Mike assumes William might not recognize him because he looks different, under Mike being the FNAF 3 guard. Judging from how Scott refused to answer the question about Scraptrap's redesign, Daco said Scott said it was a lore question, and everyone else in this game has a lore reason for their designs. I think he probably does look very different in universe. Although, I guess this is not the best argument, but you could argue William is simply talking about their first meeting in general in FNAF 3, under Mike being the guard, if the redesign isn't canon. So you guys know how Mike is a purple corpse, right? Some people say Mike couldn't possibly work at Fazbear's Fright due to his condition. Why would the Fright crew hire a walking corpse? And the Fright guard breathes when he's jump scared. This can easily be explained as the whole corpse plotline didn't exist when FNAF 3 was made. But it can also be explained in universe. As for the breathing, Mike does sigh during his speech. Sighing is just breathing, so he does have the ability to breathe. As for why he is hired, it is a horror attraction after all, and he will be playing the security guard. Maybe the guard would be dead, which is why Mike is the best choice. Or they just straight up did not care. Or maybe Mike's whole body did regenerate with Remnant, but I doubt that. Some people also say that Mike working at Fazbear's Fright contradicts him saying he's been living in shadows, but like, not really. First of all, he's working the night shift. Although we see in what we found, Hudson does work both the day shift and night shift. While he is going to act like the guard, it doesn't seem like that was always planned. Some people take issue with how friendly Phone Dude is, meaning that he and the guard must be friends, but not really. He could just be a friendly guy. Anyway, back to some more problems with the theory. As for foxing the logbook, while yes, it is good evidence on the surface, we actually don't know if this was intentional. It could have just been a creative liberty taken by the artist. And while I don't like playing the whole "it was a mistake" card, knowing the history of this franchise, especially when it comes to books, it's entirely possible. But counterpoint to that, the logbook would probably be given extra importance compared to stuff like guidebooks. So it may not be a mistake. We just aren't sure. We don't know for sure. So it could be evidence. Like, you can use that as evidence, but maybe it's not the strongest. I don't know. As for Mike setting up Happiest Day, in his speech, he says the last thing he has to do is find William. He never mentions wanting to free the souls. Although this could be a secondary goal of his, like something he would do if he could. Or Mike's speech is likely non-diegenic, meaning it doesn't actually happen, like in the timeline. It could just be showing us his motives purely going into FFPS. If helping his brother and the children was a goal of his, he would have already completed it. The last thing he has to do is find William after he survived the fire. As for everything else, the More on the Restless parallel, the FNAF 4 stuff, and the Phantoms of the Logbook, there are alternative explanations that I will talk about later. Although I guess the FNAF 4 parallels could just mean nothing and just be explained by the experiments. I don't know. They do feel pretty intentional, but whatever. Also, the movie just straight up isn't good evidence, to be honest. When you simplify it, it does make sense, but taking more into account, it doesn't really hold up. Like, where was Abby and Vanessa during FNAF 3? And the movie doesn't end in a fire? The main problem people have with Mike Guard, though, is that from a narrative perspective, it is a tad repetitive. Have a game where Mike finds his dad, goes up against the ghosts of his past, and possibly helps free the spirits, and then it ends in a fire, and then, like, a month later, Mike finds his dad, goes up against the ghosts of his past, and helps free the spirits, and it ends in a fire. Again, that's all subjective, though, and doesn't debunk the theory. I don't have a problem with it, as I think FNAF 3 does all these plot lines better. Again, doesn't matter to the theory itself. Let's just move on to our last candidate. Before I talk about Hudson, I should give a recap of the What We Found story. What We Found follows the story of Hudson, the security guard at Fazbear's Fright. Hudson is a deeply damaged person. Literally. He has nerve damage. Hudson's life in general is just kind of terrible. He was always bullied at school, particularly by his math teacher, Mr. Afton. But the abuse didn't stop at school. When he came home, Hudson was abused by his stepfather, Lewis. One day, Hudson burns down his house, killing his stepfather and accidentally killing his mother. This doesn't help Hudson's social status, as he is now an outcast pretty much. His only real friends are Barry and Dwayne, who got him a job at Fazbear's Fright, but they'll be gone soon too, as they are going out to the military. Hudson visits his grandma, who tells him to quit his job at Fazbear's Fright, but he doesn't listen. One day, Barry and Dwayne find an animatronic to use for Fazbear's Fright, Springtrap. They hook him up on the wall. Hudson goes to check it out during his night shift and notices that there is a human corpse inside. At this point, Springtrap becomes active and starts hunting Hudson. Hudson runs and hides throughout the night while dealing with the hallucinations based on the props in the attraction. Even a Chica animatronic. In the end, Hudson hides in an oven. Unfortunately for him, the oven turns on, killing Hudson. The next day, Barry and Dwayne return to the location where Springtrap is still hooked on the wall, and they supposedly find Hudson's body. Now, that was just a very brief summary of the story. I didn't get into every detail, just the important things. I recommend reading the story, as it's pretty good. With the summary of the story out of the way, let's talk about the evidence for Hudson being the FNAF 3 guard in the games. The first major piece of evidence is that Scott Cawthon said that Fazbear's Frights would fill in blanks from the past games, even stating they would go against some things the community liked. And then there's a story about a security guard going up against Springtrap in the horror attraction Fazbear's Fright, while also facing hallucinations caused by Springtrap's presence. And while the story does seem to be in a different continuity, it wouldn't be the first time characters from separate continuities carried over to the games. For example, Henry and Charlie. Or for an example in Fazbear's Fright, Coming Home doesn't seem to be in the game's continuity, but still focuses on Susie, a character from the games. What We Found could be a similar situation. It focuses on the FNAF 3 guard, but it's in a different continuity to tell its own story. Some may call out how Hudson's events in What We Found are completely different to FNAF 3. However, in the movie, the events Mike goes through are different from the games, but that's still the same character, Mike Schmidt, although he isn't an Afton in that continuity. Well, we don't know that for sure, but he probably isn't. Unless movie 2 confirms he is, then I don't know. And now the evidence for Hudson being the guard in the games includes that Phone Dude talks to the player like a friend, and some people believe he is Dwayne from the story. Though it isn't necessary that Phone Dude is Dwayne, because in the story, Hudson is friendly with the majority of the crew. Also, look at the Phantoms. Notice how they are burnt? This could be explained by Hudson's fire-related trauma. Also, Hudson could be the reason foul play isn't ruled out at the end of the game. When one of the employees of this place has a history of arson, you can't rule out the possibility of them burning the place down. And Hudson burning the place down makes sense. He was overwhelmed with what was happening, and in response, burned the place down by messing with the faulty wiring. Maybe dying in the process, explaining why he doesn't have a paycheck. Although I still feel like if the guard died, the newspaper would have said something. I don't know. In the Ultimate Guide, the book implies Hudson is the FNAF 3 guard, with this section. Is Hudson the night guard from FNAF 3? In general, the events of the story seem to follow the events of FNAF 3 almost down to the letter. right down to the ending. Hudson also experiences hallucinations throughout the night while dealing with Springtrap. Also, shortly after FNaF 4 came out, Scott said the story was found rather quickly. At this time, a majority of people thought we played as a random guy. Hudson is a random guy. He doesn't even have any connection to Freddy's outside of working at Fazbear's Fright. Now let's talk about some problems with Hudson being the guard. The logbook, of course, has Mike in the office. Assuming that isn't a mistake, it heavily points towards Mike being the guard. In fact, I'd basically say it confirms it, but I guess there are alternative explanations I'll talk about later. As for the ultimate guide, it's already wrong here. It says the events follow the FNaF 3 story right down to the letter, which is just not true. It also doesn't say definitively that Hudson is the guard. It asks if he is. And it's not like the ultimate guide is the most reliable source. It implies that Ella from 1:35 a.m. is the same as from the novels, and that is impossible. There's also the phantoms. Them being burnt does make sense with Hudson's fire-related trauma, but here's the thing, them being burnt just makes sense to everyone on this list. It's foreshadowing the end of the game for one, and PhotoDude mentions multiple times that the building can catch on fire, so it's possible the guard is paranoid about that, and that paranoia is carrying over to their hallucinations. Also, the phantoms what we found are not burnt, or at least never stated to be, and you think they would call that out. Some people take issue with what we found's numerous differences between it and FNaF 3, but it's also an 80-page story and not a full game. The main thing for Hudson Guard is that Hudson exists as the guard, and the characters have carried over to different continuities all the time, which is true. Although, to be fair, it is not unusual for characters to also not carry over if they do not fit the story. For example, in the novels, Michael Brooks possesses Golden Freddy. He does not in the games. It also seems like the Golden Freddy kid in the movie is also going to be a new character. Also in the movies, Mike's younger sister is Abby. It's Elizabeth in the games. The guard in the game could be someone else, and Hudson could just be a stand-in for them. However, we run into the problem of why was the story written then, and a series meant to fill in gaps, if not to show Hudson is the FNaF 3 guard. There are a few ideas thrown out there. One is that it was made to explain the phantoms, which can work. Some also say that the story did point to the guard's identity, but saying that Mike is the guard and Hudson is a parallel or adaptation of Mike's character, which I do want to talk about real quick. Is Hudson and Mike parallel? They do share some similarities. For example, both are night guards at a Freddy adjacent location, both accidentally kill a family member, both burn alive. Mike was most likely abused by Afton in some ways. Hudson was abused by his stepfather and his math teacher, Mr. Acton, a very similar name to Afton, but that's where the majority of their similarities end. As a kid, Hudson was bullied. Mike was a bully and was never bullied as far as we know. However, I do believe the similarities between them are intentional, since if Scott's making the story to debunk Mike being the guard, he would have to think about Mike. I could see Hudson being some weird adaptation of Mike's character if he isn't the guard, with enough differences to make him his own character separate from Mike. However, if he is the guard, then these were probably intentional to kind of make Hudson kind of similar to Mike, since Scott does know the community does like Mike as the guard, or Hudson is just reflecting Mike's character, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist in the same continuity, you know. They parallel each other, sure, but they still exist in the same continuity. So now, let's compare Mike and Hudson evidence, since they do seem to be our most likely candidates. As you can probably tell, they both have really good evidence. Usually, in a situation like this, I would use Occam's razor and choose the simplest solution, but I'm not sure if that applies here, since both solutions make sense and are pretty simple. Hudson makes sense with how Scott said Fazbear's Fright was meant to fill in blanks for the past, but the story is very inaccurate to FNaF 3. Mike makes sense with the logbook and some minor things here and there, but then Hudson exists. So when we come down to it, which one do I believe? Well, I think I'm leaning towards Hudson, honestly. I just think what we found was likely made to give us an identity to the guard and show us just this random guy Hudson. Like seriously, if Mike is the guard, why didn't Scott just write what we found to be about Mike? It's not like he wasn't comfortable writing about him, since he shows up as a major character in the story You're the Band. Although I guess that is a scrap story. I don't know, I guess under Mike Guard you could argue maybe Mike didn't fit the story Scott wanted to tell, but then why not just make a story that fits Mike better? Hudson being the guard also makes the fire at the end of the game a bit more personal, but I don't know, there are just so many little things that point towards Mike being involved with FNaF 3. It makes me think that Mike is connected to the game somehow. Some people have also tried to make both Mike and Hudson work. There is my Fright Guard duo theory, although I find that very unlikely. Some say Mike is the guard we play as in game, and what we found is a prequel or sequel with Eleanor's Springtrap. This is cool, and I have come close to believing it is a prequel, and I could see myself believing in it or the sequel option in the future depending on the circumstances, but as of now I don't think that's what Scott is going for. I did come up with a couple ideas for how all the evidence for both Mike and Hudson can work while writing this video. One of them is that Mike went to Fazbear's Fright after the fire to look for William and was somehow able to see the Phantom, which is possible since the Phantoms show up in Help Wanted, which is based on the in-universe FNaF 3 game, so it's possible that other people can see the Phantoms. And then Shadow Freddy followed him home, and FNaF 4 happened, explaining the FNaF 3 parallels in the gameplay. The only problem I have with this is that nothing really points towards Mike going to Fazbear's Fright post-fire. Another idea I had is that Mike burned down Fazbear's Fright, which is implied in The Immortal and the Restless, and then Shadow Freddy followed him home, and then the FNaF 3 gameplay stuff could work. While there, Mike sees the Phantom somehow. Although, I guess the ghost drawing could just mean nothing, since on this page Mike is drawing them as ghosts when they get to the safe room. That's what I thought for a while, but honestly, I do think it probably is the Phantoms. If there was a Bonnie and the member of the animatronics didn't line up with the number of Phantoms, yeah, I would think they're just ghosts. But like, I don't know, the exclusion of Bonnie is pretty weird. And the safe room still makes sense with them being the Phantoms, as that's where Afton was found, and it's heavily implied he is in some way responsible for the Phantom. Anyways, Mike would burn down the attraction, and yeah, might be wondering how Mike knows to go and burn down the attraction. I don't know. Probably some 0-point field shit. Or maybe I'm just forcing something to try and make all the pieces fit. I do have a problem with the idea of Mike burning down Fazbear's Fright though, as it takes away from Hudson, and it would make Hudson the most pointless protagonist in the franchise besides maybe Fritz. He doesn't even burn the place down and release Springtrap, which would make him actually do something important for the story, which sucks because I do like Hudson. He is a great character. I don't mind if Hudson is the guard, I just think I would prefer it to be someone with a connection to Freddy's at least. I'd like it when the characters are connected to Freddy's personally, what can I say? Although overall, Mike would probably be the best choice for the guard in my opinion. Like I've said before, FNAF 3 is a game-long boss fight. Mike being the one who goes up against this boss fight is just much more satisfying in my opinion. I also feel like Mike fits the themes of this game pretty well. The whole thing is, don't revive old tragedies from the past, and Mike would be contributing to this theme because he would be reliving or reviving his past as a security guard. Furthermore, I feel like Fazbear's Fright is supposed to represent the bite victim being put back together in some way. It's supposed to be like all the memories of Freddy's in one place. If you watch my Dream Theory Was Never Canon video, I think the bite victim's memories went on to influence the rest of the timeline, so it'd be like all the bite victim's memories are in one place, put back together. Not to mention the Happiest Day minigames are also played in this game, which are the bite victim's memories being put back together. So overall, it would make sense to have Mike be the protagonist when this is happening because he caused it. Furthermore, it's also based on the tragedies of Freddy's, tragedies which I believe Mike indirectly caused because I believe William only started killing after the crying child's death. I don't think it was Mike's fault, obviously, it's all William's fault, and that is just a theory, that's just my interpretation of the narrative, but under my interpretation, I feel like Mike does fit the best as the protagonist, because he would be facing the tragedies that he indirectly caused, or that he feels he indirectly caused. It's just what I think, though. I could be completely wrong. Maybe William was killing before the bite victim's death. Oh, so a 1v1 between the main protagonist and antagonist is just too good, man. I know it might be a little repetitive, but I don't care. Honestly, I feel like FNAF 6 being a round 2 between Mike and William makes that game's better, and I don't really care if they faced off a little bit before that. Of course, none of this actually matters as Hudson is the guard, but I just want to get my thoughts out there. So to finally end this video, I want to rank the candidates based on how likely they are. Number 7, we have Sammy. He just has no evidence. Number 6 is William. Pretty interesting idea, but I don't think it's what Scott is going for. Number 5, Fritz. Pretty good under just 1 to 3. Outside of that, he doesn't really hold up though. 4, Henry. Decent theory, but the evidence can be explained without him being the guard. 3, Cassie's dad. Really good and underrated theory. I could see him being the guard, it's just that the other 2 candidates have more evidence as of now. Number 2, Mike. Great theory. Would believe this one if number 1 didn't exist. Number 1, Hudson. Not only a good theory, but most likely what Scott is going for. So in the end, I'm sure you can see why the Fright Guard debate is frustrating. Both of the primary theories have good evidence, and both seem equally likely. I think this is one of the things that needs more clarification, honestly. Does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? No. So who do you guys think the guard is? Let me know in the comments. And while you're down there, tell me what you think of the 2 theories I proposed at the end of this video. But right before you do that, you should like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Hopefully it won't be so long.